This cabin, Mr. Hayes, is no longer yours. It belongs to the community. Now pack your sentimental junk and get off our land." The words, slick with a venomous sweetness, slid from the lips of Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She stood on my porch, a floral muumuu stretched taut over a frame that seemed to absorb all the light around it, her face a mask of smug certainty. In her hand, she brandished a sheaf of papers like a scepter, the top page bearing the bold, ugly words, "Notice of Foreclosure Auction." Behind her, parked crookedly on my gravel driveway, her golf cart, the community patrol vehicle as she called it, hummed with an irritating electric whine, a chariot for a petty tyrant. My blood ran cold, then hot. Every instinct honed over 25 years in the United States Army screamed at me to react, to dismantle this threat with cold efficiency. But I held my ground, my hands resting lightly on the porch railing I had built with my own two hands, the cedar warm beneath my palms. This cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was a sanctuary, a monument to my late wife, Sarah, the last pure thing in a world that had grown complicated and loud. And this woman, this bureaucratic parasite, thought she could take it from me over a fence. If you've ever dealt with a power-tripping HOA president who gets high on the smell of their own regulations, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've got your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear it. Misery loves company, but justice loves an audience. My particular nightmare didn't begin with the foreclosure notice on my porch. It started 3 months earlier, with a piece of beige letterhead and a violation so absurd it would have been funny if it hadn't been the first salvo in an all-out war. My name is Marcus Hayes, Sergeant Major, retired. For a quarter of a century, I served in the Army Corps of Engineers. My life was one of precision, of blueprints and stress tolerances, of building things that last under the worst conditions imaginable. I built bridges under fire in places you've only seen on the news, and I learned that a solid foundation is everything, whether you're talking about a structure or a man's character. When I retired, I came home to the piece of land Sarah and I had bought years before we even knew what an HOA was. It was 5 acres of dense pine and solid granite, bordering a state forest. Here, with my own hands, I built our dream cabin. It wasn't a mansion. It was a fortress of peace crafted from local cedar and stone, with a porch that looked out over a valley that caught the morning sun just right. It was where Sarah spent her last, best years, and after she was gone, it was where I kept her memory alive. The Whispering Pines Estates development grew up around my property years later, a sprawling collection of cookie-cutter homes for people who wanted the illusion of country living without the mud. I owned my land free and clear, a holdout from a different era. The developer, a reasonable man named Henderson, had tried to buy me out. I politely refused. So we came to an agreement. I would join their new HOA for a nominal fee, purely for access to the paved road they were building and their snow removal service, which was a godsend in the winter. The contract was explicit. My property, with its pre-existing structures, was grandfathered in, exempt from all aesthetic covenants. It was a simple, ironclad agreement, signed and notarized. For years it worked. The HOA was a benign entity that collected dues and plowed the road. But then Henderson sold the last of his lots and moved to Florida. The power vacuum was filled by Karen Miller, a recent transplant from some overregulated suburb who saw the HOA bylaws not as a guide for community living, but as a weapon to be wielded. She was a woman who had never built anything in her life, but had an insatiable desire to tear things down. The first sign of trouble arrived in my mailbox, nestled between a seed catalog and a letter from my old platoon sergeant. It was a formal-looking letter from the Whispering Pines HOA Architectural Review Committee, a committee of one, Karen. It informed me that my split-rail fence was in violation of Bylaw 17, Section C, Paragraph 2. Fences within the community must be of a uniform white vinyl material and shall not exceed a height of 4 feet. My fence, the one I built with Sarah a decade ago, was rustic cedar. It followed the natural contour of my land, meaning it was 5 feet high in the dips and 4.5 along the rises. It was strong, beautiful, and had stood for 10 years without a single complaint. According to Karen, it was now an eyesore, a blight on her vision of suburban conformity. The letter concluded with a demand that I remove and replace the offending structure within 30 days or face a $50 fine. I almost laughed. $50. It was an insult, a clear power play. She wasn't just trying to enforce a rule. She was testing my defenses, probing for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't get angry. I got organized. That evening, I went down to my workshop, a place of order and purpose. I pulled out my original agreement with Henderson, my property deed, and the county survey maps. I made crisp, clean copies. I drafted a response, my language polite but firm, professional but unyielding. I cited the specific clause in my HOA agreement regarding pre-existing structures. I attached the supporting documents. I explained, as one might to a child, that Bylaw 17 did not and could not apply to my property. I sent the entire package via certified mail, return receipt requested. In my world, you don't go into a fight without a paper trail. You document everything. You build your case like you'd build a bridge, layer by layer, with reinforced steel and solid concrete. A week later, there was no letter. There was only the electric whine of her golf cart coming up my drive. The battle had just begun. Karen Miller's golf cart, a monstrously oversized vehicle with lifted suspension and knobby tires, crunched to a halt on my gravel, kicking up dust that settled on the hydrangeas Sarah had planted. She didn't get out right away, preferring to let her presence marinate in the quiet afternoon air. When she finally heaved herself out, she moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone who believes their every step reshapes the earth beneath them. She was holding a clipboard, the modern-day scepter of the petty official. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice a syrupy drawl that failed to conceal its condescending edge. "We seem to have a communication problem." I remained on my porch, one hand on the railing, my stance relaxed but ready. "I thought my communication was perfectly clear, Mrs. Miller. I sent you a letter, certified mail. It should have answered all your questions." She waved a dismissive hand, the clipboard flapping. "Oh, I got your little package. Very military of you. Lots of copies and highlighting. But you seem to be operating under a delusion. That old piece of paper you have with Mr. Henderson, it's irrelevant. There's a new board now, my board, and we have new rules for the betterment of the entire community." Her use of "my board" was telling. It wasn't a community organization. It was her personal fiefdom. "A contract is a contract, ma'am," I said, my voice even. "My property's status is legally binding. Your new rules don't supersede a signed agreement." Karen actually chuckled, a sound like gravel in a blender. "That discipline and order stuff might work in the Army, Sergeant, but this is a civilized community. We value harmony and aesthetic cohesion. Your rustic fence," she said the word rustic, as if it were a communicable disease, "is a jarring element. It lowers property values." I glanced at my fence, the way the weathered cedar rails curved with the land, the strength in its simple, honest construction. It was a part of this place. Her vision of white plastic prisons lining every lot was the real jarring element. "My property values are my concern," I replied, "and I have a professional appraisal from 6 months ago that suggests this cabin and its rustic fence are worth quite a bit more than any of the vinyl-sided boxes down the hill." Her smile tightened, the sweetness curdling at the edges. "That's an inflammatory and elitist attitude, Mr. Hayes. We are all equal here in Whispering Pines. The rules apply to everyone, especially to those who think they're special." She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "This is your official verbal warning. The letter was your written one. You have 15 days to submit a plan for compliance to the Architectural Review Committee. That means removing the non-compliant structure and replacing it with an approved vinyl fence. If you fail to do so, the $50 fine will be levied, and it will double every week thereafter. Is that clear?" It was perfectly clear. It was extortion. It was a declaration of war over 5 feet of cedar. I could have paid the $50. I could have paid for a new fence 100 times over. But it was never about the money or the fence. It was about principle. It was about a bully trying to force her will on someone who wouldn't bend. It was about defending the sanctity of a home built on a promise to my wife. "Your warning is noted," I said, my tone giving nothing away. "You can expect my formal response in due course." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching for a crack in my composure. Finding none, she sniffed, turned with a theatrical huff, and squeezed herself back into her golf cart. As she drove away, I saw a small, smug smile playing on her lips. She thought she had me. She thought this was a simple matter of attrition, that she could bury me in fines and paperwork until I surrendered. She was about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between a battle of wills and a strategic campaign. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in my workshop and transformed it into a command center. I bought a heavy-duty 3-ring binder and a label maker. The first tab was labeled "The Fence." I filed her letter, my certified mail receipt, and a detailed time-stamped memo of our conversation, including direct quotes. I took high-resolution photographs of the fence from every angle, along with photos of the surrounding landscape to demonstrate how it integrated with the natural environment. I was preparing for a siege, and ammunition in this war was documentation. The first $50 fine arrived exactly 15 days later. I responded not with a check, but with another certified letter, reiterating my legal position and formally disputing the fine. A week later, a new letter arrived. Failure to comply, fine, $100. Previous balance, $50. Total due, $150. This one was more aggressive, citing clauses about maintaining community standards and the board's authority to enforce them. My binder grew thicker. The paper war escalated with the grim predictability of an artillery barrage. Each week, a new envelope from the HOA would appear in my mailbox, the escalating numbers inside feeling less like a bill and more like a countdown. $150 became $350. $350 became $750. With each notice, Karen's language grew more imperious. The fines were no longer just about the fence. Suddenly, I was in violation for other, more ludicrous infractions. An official notice printed on the same beige letterhead informed me that my F-250 pickup truck was a commercial vehicle and could not be parked in my own driveway for more than 24 consecutive hours, per a bylaw designed to keep plumbers' vans and construction equipment off the streets. My truck, which I used for hauling firewood from my own property and picking up groceries, was now an industrial eyesore. I received a violation for the color of the stain on my cabin cedar siding. It was a natural sealant designed to protect the wood, but according to Karen, it was not on the pre-approved palette of beige, grayish, or taupe. The fine for that was $200. Then came the wind chimes. They were a gift from Sarah's sister, delicate bamboo tubes that made a soft, hollow sound in the breeze. They hung from a hook on my porch, barely audible from my own driveway, let alone from any neighbor's property. A notice arrived citing a noise ordinance violation. The tonal frequency of unapproved decorative items must not exceed ambient decibel levels. It was bureaucratic gibberish, a rule invented on the spot to add another layer to my financial burden. The fines were now well over $2,000, a mountain of paper built on a foundation of pure malice. For every notice she sent, I sent a reply. Certified mail, always. My letters were calm, factual, and legally precise. I disputed each fine, citing my grandfathered status for the structural issues and the sheer absurdity of the others. I requested minutes from the board meetings where these new, hyper-specific rules were allegedly passed. I requested evidence of the complaints that supposedly triggered these violations. My binder became 2 binders. They were thick with tabs, cross-references, and highlighted passages from the HOA's own labyrinthine book of covenants. I knew those documents better than Karen did. I knew the loopholes, the contradictions, and the vague language she was twisting to her own ends. I decided it was time to take the fight to her turf. The next monthly HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled of air freshener and quiet desperation. I arrived early and took a seat in the back. The room slowly filled with my neighbors. I saw the Millers, an elderly couple who had lived here for 20 years, their faces etched with worry. I saw the Garcias, a young family with 2 small children, who looked exhausted. The dozen or so residents in attendance shared a common look, a kind of weary resignation. They were subjects, not members. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her two bored cronies, a timid-looking man named Bob, and a severe woman named Patricia, who echoed Karen's every pronouncement. Karen ran the meeting like a drill sergeant with a Napoleon complex. She breezed through the agenda, tolerating no questions, steamrolling any hint of dissent. When she opened the floor for new business, I stood up. "Marcus Hayes, 1 Aspen Lane," I said, my voice carrying easily in the quiet room. "I have a few questions regarding the series of violation notices and fines I've received." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Hayes, this is not the appropriate forum for personal grievances. You need to submit your concerns in writing to the board." "I've submitted 7 letters in writing, Mrs. Miller, all via certified mail. I have yet to receive a substantive response, only more fines." A murmur went through the room. I had their attention. I continued, holding up a copy of the wind chime violation. "I'd like to know when the board approved the bylaw regarding the tonal frequency of wind chimes. I've reviewed the last 6 months of meeting minutes available on the community website, and I can't seem to find any mention of it." Bob fidgeted with his pen. Patricia stared at a point on the wall just over my head. Karen's face flushed a deep, angry red. "The board has the authority to interpret and enforce existing nuisance ordinances," she snapped. "Your chimes were the subject of a complaint." "From whom?" I asked calmly. "We are not required to disclose the source of complaints. It protects residents from retaliation." "Retaliation from what? A gentle breeze?" I pressed on. "And what about the commercial vehicle designation for my personal truck? Or the unapproved stain on my pre-existing structure? These seem less like enforcement of existing rules and more like a targeted campaign of harassment." The word harassment hung in the air. I saw Mr. Miller nod almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Garcia exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with her husband. "Your accusations are baseless and insulting," Karen declared, banging a small gavel on the table. "You are out of order. If you have a problem with the fines, you can pay them and file an appeal. Next item." She shut me down, but the damage was done. I had planted a seed of doubt. I had shown the other residents that the Empress, in fact, had no clothes. As the meeting broke up, a few people avoided my eyes, but Mr. Miller walked over to me, his hand slightly trembling. "That took guts, son," he whispered. "She's been after us for months about our vegetable garden. Says it's not aesthetically pleasing." I knew then that I wasn't alone. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a fight for the soul of the community. Karen thought she was burying me in paper, but she was only giving me the evidence I needed to bury her. The official-looking envelope that arrived a week after the HOA meeting was thicker than the others. It wasn't another fine. It was a notice of intent to place lien on my property for the accumulated sum of $3,850 in unpaid fines and administrative fees. This was the nuclear option in the HOA arsenal. A lien would cloud my title, making it impossible for me to sell or refinance my home until the debt was paid. It was a legal cudgel designed to beat stubborn homeowners into submission. For Karen, it was the next logical step in her campaign of conquest. For me, it was the signal to stop playing defense and launch my counteroffensive. A good soldier knows you can't win a war by staying in the trench. You have to understand the terrain, the enemy's strength, and their weaknesses. It was time for some reconnaissance. I started with public records, something I had become intimately familiar with. I ran a search on Karen Miller and her board members. It was mostly boring: mortgage documents, voter registrations. But then I found something interesting. Karen had been the president of 2 other HOAs in 2 different states before moving to Whispering Pines. A little more digging online revealed a pattern. In both communities, local news articles and forum posts told a similar story. A sudden, drastic increase in fines, aggressive enforcement of obscure rules, and lawsuits against residents who fought back. She was a professional tyrant, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, leaving a trail of misery and legal bills in her wake. This wasn't just a personality flaw, it was her modus operandi. My next step was to talk to my neighbors, but quietly. I started with the Millers. I went to their house with a plate of my wife's famous lemon bars and a copy of the HOA's governing documents. Over coffee, they told me how Karen had fined them for their small, immaculately kept vegetable garden, claiming it violated rules about landscaping uniformity. They were in their late 70s on a fixed income, and the threat of fines terrified them. I showed them the exact wording in the bylaws which only prohibited unkempt or overgrown plots. Their garden was a work of art. The fines were fraudulent. I did the same with the Garcias. Their crime was a portable basketball hoop that their son used in their driveway. Karen had deemed it a temporary structure that was not being stored out of sight after use, despite the fact that their son used it every day. Again, the bylaw was vague, and her interpretation was the most draconian one possible. They had taken it down, not wanting to risk the fines. Their son's face fell every time he looked at the empty spot in the driveway. I wasn't giving them legal advice. I was a retired engineer, not a lawyer. But I could read a blueprint, and I could read a contract. I showed them the facts, the text, the raw data. I helped them draft formal letters of dispute, just like mine, citing the specific language of the bylaws she was misusing. We were forming a small, quiet resistance. But the real key, the ace I had been holding up my sleeve, was something nobody in Whispering Pines knew about me. I wasn't just Marcus Hayes, the quiet veteran in the cabin. After I retired from the Army, I needed a new mission. Sitting still wasn't in my DNA. I used my savings and a loan from the GI Bill to buy a small, struggling title insurance company. My old commanding officer, General Thompson, a man who saw more potential in me than I saw in myself, co-signed the business loan without a moment's hesitation. He told me, "Hayes, you spent your life building things on solid ground. Now make sure everyone else has solid ground to build on." I named it Bedrock Title and Escrow. We weren't flashy. We didn't run big ads. Our reputation was built on being meticulous, thorough, and utterly incorruptible. In the world of real estate, a policy from Bedrock was as good as gold. Over 15 years, we grew. We became the largest, most respected title insurer in the county. I never put my name on the door as president and CEO. To my employees, I was just Marcus. To the community, I was invisible, just the way I liked it. That evening, I drove not home, but to my office in town. I let myself into the quiet, dark building and went to the records vault. I pulled the master file for the Whispering Pines Estate subdivision. My fingers traced the developer's name, Henderson, and then I saw it. The underwriter for the entire development, for every single lot sold, for every mortgage issued, for the common areas deeded to the HOA itself, was Bedrock Title and Escrow, my company. I held in my hands the title policies that guaranteed the legal ownership of every single homeowner Karen was terrorizing. I guaranteed the legal integrity of the very land the HOA stood on. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Karen Miller had just filed a lien against a property whose title was insured by a company owned by the man she was filing the lien against. She was trying to attack my fortress from the outside, completely unaware that I had built the fortress, owned the blueprints, and held the keys to every single door. The game had just changed. She thought she was playing checkers. I was about to show her what chess looked like. I had access to every deed, every covenant, every easement, and every lien ever filed in her little kingdom. And I was about to conduct a full-scale audit. Armed with the knowledge that I held the ultimate trump card, my strategy shifted from defense to a carefully planned encirclement. The first phase was to solidify my alliance. The Millers and the Garcias were the emotional core of our small rebellion, but I needed more soldiers. I spent the next week having quiet conversations. I'd run into people at the community mailboxes or the local grocery store. I'd start by talking about the weather, then casually mention the absurd violation notice I'd received. It was like lancing a boil. The frustration and resentment poured out. One man was fined because his trash cans were visible from the street for 2 hours after the garbage truck had come. A single mother was cited because her daughter's playset was made of redwood instead of the approved cedar. Everyone had a story. Everyone was afraid. Everyone thought they were alone. I organized a meeting, not at the clubhouse, but at a neutral location, a private room in a diner in the next town over. I paid for coffee and donuts out of my own pocket. 7 families showed up, including the Millers and the Garcias. They were nervous, glancing at the door as if expecting Karen to burst in. I laid out my binders on the table, a testament to the paper war I'd been fighting. I walked them through my process, the documentation, the certified letters, the referencing of specific bylaws. Then I told them about Karen's history, the pattern of abuse in her previous communities. The mood in the room shifted from fear to anger. "She forced the Hendersons to sell," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice trembling with rage. "They were our friends. She fined them into the ground over the color of their front door." "She has to be stopped," Mr. Miller said, his fist clenched on the table. "But how? She controls the board. She controls the management company. She has the lawyers." That's when I played my first card. She controls the board, I agreed, but she doesn't control the facts, and she doesn't control the money. I called in a favor. My old platoon sergeant Sully had become a forensic accountant after his time in the service. He was a wizard with numbers, a man who could find a single misplaced penny in the Pentagon's budget. I asked him to take a look at the Whispering Pines HOA's financials, which were, by law, available to all members. I sent him the link to the community portal. 2 days later, Sully called me. "Marcus," he said, his voice grim, "this isn't just mismanagement. This is a piggy bank." He explained what he'd found. The HOA's budget showed huge, vaguely defined line items. Over $50,000 a year went to professional consulting services. Another $60,000 was for common area landscaping and maintenance. The numbers were wildly inflated for a community our size. The snow removal contract was nearly double the market rate. "It stinks, Marcus," Sully concluded. "This isn't incompetence. It's theft." I needed to know who was on the receiving end of that money. For that, I called Dave, a former Army intelligence guy who now ran a private investigation firm. Dave could find a needle in a haystack, even if the haystack was in another country and didn't want to be found. I gave him the line item descriptions. It took him less than 24 hours. The professional consulting services firm was a shell company registered to an address in Delaware. But the sole proprietor, Karen's brother-in-law, the common area landscaping company, was a local outfit, but its ownership records led straight to her nephew. The snow removal contract was held by a company owned by the cousin of Patricia, the severe-looking woman on the board. It was a classic self-dealing scheme, a family and friends network bleeding the community dry. They were using our dues to enrich themselves while simultaneously using fraudulent fines to terrorize us. The fence, the wind chimes, the vegetable garden. It was all a distraction, a smokescreen of tyranny to make everyone too scared to look at the books. While my team was uncovering the rot in the HOA's finances, Karen was moving forward with her own attack. The final notice arrived, delivered by a process server this time. It was a thick packet from the HOA's law firm. They had officially filed for foreclosure. An auction date was set for my cabin in 60 days. They were going to sell my home, Sarah's home, on the courthouse steps to satisfy a fraudulent debt of a few $1,000s. I looked at the legal documents, the cold, formal language detailing the end of my life here. The process server stood awkwardly on my porch, a young kid who looked like he hated his job. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled. I just nodded and took the papers. I closed the door and walked to my desk. I spread the foreclosure documents out next to my own growing file, her paperwork versus mine, her lawyers versus my truth. She thought this was the kill shot. She had no idea she had just walked directly into the kill zone I had prepared for her. It was time to call my own lawyer, and it was time for Bedrock Title and Escrow to officially enter the fray. The quiet, invisible man in the cabin was about to make his presence known, and the shockwave was going to shatter Karen Miller's little empire. The lawyer I called was no ordinary attorney. Her name was Jessica Albright, a partner at the most respected law firm in the state. She was sharp, relentless, and specialized in complex property and corporate law. She also happened to be the daughter of my old mentor, General Thompson. I had known Jessica since she was a kid with pigtails who used to come to the base picnics. Now she was a legal powerhouse. I met her in her corner office overlooking the city. I didn't bring my binders. I had scanned every page and brought them on a single, encrypted flash drive. I laid out the entire story. The fence, the escalation, the harassment of my neighbors, Sully's financial analysis, Dave's investigation into the shell companies, and finally my ownership of Bedrock Title. As I spoke, her expression shifted from professional sympathy to a focused, predatory intensity. When I explained my position as the owner of the title company that insured the entire subdivision, She leaned back in her leather chair, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Marcus," she said, her voice a low hum of excitement, "this is the most beautiful case of prosecutorial overreach I have ever seen. She hasn't just given us a sword, she's handed us the entire armory." We spent the next 4 hours mapping out the strategy. It would be a multi-front assault designed to overwhelm and dismantle Karen's power structure from every conceivable angle. Jessica sketched it out on a whiteboard, a battle plan of legal maneuvers. First, the title challenge. This was the bombshell. As president of Bedrock Title, I drafted a formal letter, which Jessica then polished into a masterpiece of legal lethality. The letter was addressed to the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, their management company, and their legal counsel. It stated in no uncertain terms that Bedrock Title and Escrow had been made aware of significant administrative and financial irregularities within the HOA's governance. These irregularities, including a pattern of improperly filed liens and potential fiduciary malfeasance, constituted a material risk to the chain of title for all properties within the subdivision. Therefore, the letter continued, Bedrock was immediately placing a temporary moratorium on the issuance of any new title insurance policies for sales or refinances within Whispering Pines estates. Furthermore, we were initiating a full-scale audit of every covenant, easement, and lien recorded by the HOA since its inception to assess the scope of the potential title cloud. The letter was sent via courier to each party. The effect would be immediate and catastrophic. It meant that no one in the entire neighborhood could sell their house. No one could refinance their mortgage. The real estate value of every single home in Whispering Pines was, in an instant, frozen solid. We had effectively quarantined the entire subdivision. The second prong of the attack was the lawsuit. Jessica's team worked around the clock, drafting a comprehensive civil suit. The plaintiffs were myself, the Millers, the Garcias, and 4 other families who had been systematically harassed and fined. The defendants were Karen Miller personally, her board cronies, Bob and Patricia, and the HOA as a corporate entity. The suit alleged a litany of offenses: breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to defraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of state laws governing homeowners associations. We asked for punitive damages, the reversal of all fraudulent fines, the removal of all liens, and the immediate dissolution of the current board. Simultaneously, we filed for an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure sale of my cabin. The third and final prong was public exposure. We knew that a creature like Karen thrived in the darkness of bureaucratic procedure. We needed to drag her into the light. We compiled a press kit. It contained a summary of our lawsuit, copies of the most outrageously petty violation notices. The wind chimes were a particular favorite. A simplified breakdown of Sully's financial findings, and a carefully worded statement from me, identifying myself as a retired veteran fighting for his home. We gave the entire package exclusively to a local investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins, a bulldog who had a reputation for sinking her teeth into stories of local corruption and never letting go. With all the pieces in place, we waited. It didn't take long. The first call Jessica received was from the HOA's lawyer. He was a blustering, arrogant man who had likely been coasting on easy HOA cases for years. He started the call with threats and dismissals. "This is a frivolous and vexatious lawsuit," he bellowed over the speakerphone in Jessica's office. "My clients will not be intimidated." Jessica let him finish, then calmly replied, "Have you received a letter from Bedrock Title and Escrow yet, Mr. Davison?" There was a pause. "I did receive some nonsensical letter, yes. It's meaningless." "Is it?" Jessica asked, her voice turning to ice. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, every property in your client's subdivision has a clouded title. I have already received calls from 3 different mortgage lenders and 2 real estate agencies who are pulling out of pending deals in Whispering Pines. Your client's single largest asset, the value of their own homes, is now worthless on the open market. So you can talk to me about my frivolous lawsuit, or you can start talking to your clients about the multi-million-dollar liability they've just incurred for every single resident in that community. Your choice." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. We could almost hear the gears in his head grinding, the arrogance being replaced by sheer, cold panic. He mumbled something about needing to confer with his clients and hung up. The first shot had struck home, a direct hit to their financial foundation. The second shot landed that evening on the 6 o'clock news. Sarah Jenkins led her broadcast with the story, "Local Veteran Fights, Predatory HOA, Alleges Corruption and Fraud in Whispering Pines Estates." She laid out the whole story, showing pictures of my cabin, the fence, and interviews with the Millers and Garcias, their faces blurred to protect them from immediate retaliation. She detailed the financial self-dealing, putting up graphics showing the flow of money to Karen's relatives. The report was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a damning indictment of Karen's entire regime. The siege was now complete. Karen was trapped, legally, financially, and publicly. The only thing left was the final, face-to-face confrontation. And I knew just the place for it: the next HOA meeting. The night of the monthly HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the clubhouse was nothing like the subdued, depressing affair I had attended weeks before. The air was thick with tension and electricity, a palpable mix of anger, fear, and a dawning sense of empowerment. The room was packed, standing room only. People I had never seen at a meeting before were there, their faces grim, many of them clutching copies of the newspaper or talking in hushed, furious tones about the news report. This wasn't a meeting of subjects anymore. It was a gathering of revolutionaries. I took my seat in the front row this time, flanked by Mr. Miller on one side and Mr. Garcia on the other. My binder sat on my lap, not as a shield, but as a weapon waiting to be deployed. When Karen and her two board members, Bob and Patricia, entered the room, a wave of hostile silence washed over the crowd. They looked like they had aged a decade in the last week. Bob's face was pale and sweaty. Patricia's severe expression had been replaced by a pinched, haunted look. And Karen was a sight to behold. She was dressed in a defiantly bright pink pantsuit, a garish suit of armor against the tidal wave of scorn directed at her. Her face was a mask of forced composure, but her eyes darted around the room, betraying the panic beneath. She was cornered, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. She banged the gavel with more force than necessary. "This meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association will come to order," she announced, her voice strained. She tried to rush through the opening pleasantries, the Pledge of Allegiance, the approval of the last meeting's minutes, but the crowd was restless. "Let's dispense with the formalities, Karen," a voice called out from the back. "Why don't you tell us about your nephew's landscaping company?" A chorus of angry agreements followed. Karen's face darkened. "That is not on the agenda," she snapped. "We will follow the proper procedure. The first item is a review of the recent legal matter." She looked down at her notes, unable to meet the eyes of the people she was supposed to represent. She launched into a prepared statement, her words dripping with self-pity and righteous indignation. She painted herself as the victim, a dedicated volunteer working thanklessly for the good of the community, now under attack by a disgruntled and non-compliant resident who was spreading malicious lies to the media. She called our lawsuit a frivolous and desperate attempt to avoid paying duly assessed fines. The arrogance was breathtaking. Even with her world crumbling around her, she couldn't help but double down. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat, the residents seemingly stunned by her audacity. Then I stood up. I didn't wait to be called on. I walked to the front of the room and stood beside the table, facing the audience, my back partially to her. I wanted to speak to my neighbors, not to her. "My name is Marcus Hayes," I began, my voice calm and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "And I am the disgruntled resident Mrs. Miller is referring to. It's true, I am disgruntled. I'm disgruntled that Mr. Miller, a man who has lived here for 20 years, was threatened and fined for growing his own food. I'm disgruntled that the Garcia family was made to feel like criminals because their son wanted to play basketball in his own driveway. I'm disgruntled that every single person in this room has been living in fear of a letter, a fine, a knock on the door from a woman who has twisted our community's rules into a weapon of personal power." I turned to face Karen now, my eyes locking with hers. "You talk about duly assessed fines. Let's talk about your finances instead. Let's talk about the $50,000 a year you pay to a consulting firm owned by your brother-in-law. What exactly does he consult on?" Karen, how to draft fraudulent violation notices. The room erupted. Karen banged her gavel furiously. You are out of order. This is slander. Is it? I countered, my voice rising slightly for the first time. Is it slander to point out that the landscaping company that overcharges us by 30% is owned by your nephew? Is it slander to ask why the snow removal contract, which leaves our roads icy until noon, is held by Patricia's cousin? This isn't a community, Karen. It's a grift. You've been using our homes as your personal ATM. I let that sink in. Then I delivered the final, decisive blow. But your biggest mistake wasn't the theft. It wasn't the harassment. It was underestimating who you were dealing with. You see, you all know me as Marcus, the retired guy in the cabin. What you don't know is what I've been doing for the last 15 years. My name is Marcus Hayes, and I am the president and CEO of Bedrock Title and Escrow. A collective gasp went through the room. The homeowners understood the significance of that name instantly. It was on their closing documents, their mortgage papers. It was the company that guaranteed the very value of their homes. Karen's jaw went slack. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, shocked pallor. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. The letter your lawyer dismissed as nonsensical came from my company, I continued, my voice now cold and hard as granite. It informed you that because of the fraud and mismanagement you have perpetrated, the legal titles to every single property in this subdivision are now potentially clouded. This means that until this situation is resolved, until you and your corrupt board are removed, nobody in this room can sell their house. Nobody can get a home equity loan. Nobody can refinance their mortgage. You thought you were just taking my cabin, Karen, but in your greed and your arrogance, you have taken the financial security of every single one of your neighbors and held it hostage. Their largest investment is now worthless, all because of you. I turned back to the crowd. The choice is yours. You can continue to live under this tyranny, or you can take your community back. Right now, it was a declaration of independence. Mr. Miller stood up, his voice shaking but clear. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the board and a motion for their removal, effective immediately. The room exploded in a roar of "Aye!" It was a tidal wave of righteous fury, washing away Karen's pathetic defenses. She just sat there, frozen as the community she thought she owned rose up and took back what was theirs. Her reign was over. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was a whirlwind of legal and communal action. The vote of no confidence was nearly unanimous. Karen, Bob, and Patricia sat in stunned silence as, one by one, their neighbors and former victims stood up and voted them out of power. They were stripped of their titles and their authority on the spot. An emergency interim board was elected, with a visibly emotional Mr. Miller unanimously chosen as its president. His first act was to formally declare all fines and liens issued under Karen's tenure as null and void, pending a full audit. The room erupted in cheers and applause, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. For Karen, the public humiliation was only the beginning of her downfall. Faced with our lawsuit and the undeniable evidence of financial crimes, the HOA's insurance carrier informed the old board members that their directors and officers' policy would not cover actions related to fraud or intentional misconduct. They were on their own. Their lawyer, Mr. Davison, who had been so arrogant on the phone, formally resigned as counsel the very next day, citing an irreparable breakdown of the attorney-client relationship. Stripped of their power, their legal protection, and their lawyer, they were exposed and vulnerable. Jessica Albright moved with surgical precision. She filed our evidence of embezzlement and self-dealing with the county district attorney's office. The DA, smelling a high-profile local corruption case, launched a formal criminal investigation within 48 hours. Investigators descended on the HOA management company, seizing computers, financial records, and correspondence. The web of deceit Karen had so carefully woven was being unraveled thread by thread. Her cronies, Bob and Patricia, folded almost immediately. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges and financial ruin, they turned on Karen, offering testimony and evidence to the DA in exchange for lesser charges. They painted a picture of a domineering president who controlled every decision, manipulated the finances, and threatened anyone who questioned her. They were weak people who had been swept up in her wake, and they abandoned her just as quickly to save themselves. Karen's carefully constructed world imploded. The friends who had attended her garden parties now crossed the street to avoid her. The neighbors she had terrorized now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She became a prisoner in her own vinyl-sided box, the very model of conformity she had tried to enforce upon everyone else. I didn't see her for weeks after the meeting. Life in Whispering Pines began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The new board, under Mr. Miller's gentle guidance, began the painstaking process of untangling the mess Karen had left behind. They hired a reputable, independent accounting firm to conduct a full audit. They started rewriting the bylaws to ensure transparency and prevent such an abuse of power from ever happening again. My company, Bedrock Title, worked alongside them, providing guidance on how to properly record documents and maintain a clear chain of title for the community, free of charge. It was our civic duty. Our lawsuit was settled quickly. The HOA's insurance, while not covering Karen's fraud, did cover the board's general mismanagement. A significant settlement was paid out, distributed among the families who had been targeted. It covered their legal fees and served as compensation for the harassment they had endured. All fraudulent liens were professionally expunged from the county records. The foreclosure against my cabin was, of course, dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. I saw Karen one last time, about 2 months later. It wasn't in a courtroom or at a dramatic confrontation. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A large, ugly U-Haul truck was parked in her driveway. I was walking my property line, checking the fence that had started it all, when I saw her carrying a box out of her house. She looked smaller, diminished. The bright, garish colors she used to wear were gone, replaced by drab, shapeless sweats. Her face was pale and puffy, stripped of its usual mask of smug authority. Her own house, I later learned, was being sold in a distress sale to pay for her mounting legal bills and the restitution the court would eventually order as part of her plea bargain. She was losing her home because she had tried to take mine. The irony was poetic. She saw me standing there by my cedar fence. Her eyes, once filled with such venomous certainty, now held a flicker of something else. Hatred, yes, but also a deep, bottomless defeat. She opened her mouth as if to say something, a final curse perhaps, but no words came out. She just stared. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked back at her, held her gaze for a long moment, and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of finality, an acknowledgement of the battle fought and won. No words were necessary. The message was clear. You are finished here. She broke eye contact first, turning away to heave another box into the truck. I turned and walked back toward my cabin, the scent of pine and cedar filling the air. The war was over. The seasons turned, and the scars on the community began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of fear that Karen had cultivated was replaced by a new spirit of cooperation and neighborliness. The new HOA board, led by Mr. Miller, operated with a transparency that was almost radical in its simplicity. Meeting minutes were posted online within 24 hours. The budget was presented in a clear, easy-to-understand format. Every expenditure was accounted for. The dues were actually lowered once the corrupt contracts were terminated and replaced with honest, local vendors. The landscaping in the common areas had never looked better. The roads were plowed promptly after the first snow. It turned out that when you weren't siphoning off funds to your relatives, you could provide excellent services for a reasonable price. My company completed its audit and, working with the new board, issued letters of certification to every homeowner, confirming that their titles were clear and unencumbered. The quarantine was lifted. The value of our homes, once held hostage, was restored, but the real change was in the people. The Miller's vegetable garden flourished, a riot of green beans, heirloom tomatoes, and zucchini. They hosted a small harvest festival and invited the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Miller's tomato sauce became legendary. The Garcia's basketball hoop was back in the driveway, and the sound of their son practicing his shots became a familiar, happy rhythm in the afternoons. Other small acts of defiance against the old regime popped up like wildflowers. Brightly colored front doors appeared. People put up bird feeders and decorative flags. A sense of individuality and freedom returned to Whispering Pines. We held a community barbecue in the park that fall. It was the first such event in years. Kids ran laughing through the grass, and neighbors who had only ever exchanged wary nods now shared stories and hamburgers. I brought a cooler full of drinks and sat at a picnic table with Sully and Dave, who had driven up for the occasion. "You know," Sully said, munching on a hot dog, "for a guy who likes his peace and quiet, you sure know how to start a revolution." I looked around at the scene, at Mr. Miller proudly showing off a prize-winning tomato, at Mrs. Garcia laughing as her son finally made a basket, at the simple, profound peace of a community at ease with itself. "Sometimes," I said, "you have to fight for your peace. It's the most valuable property you can own." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I drove my F-250, my non-commercial, perfectly legal F-250, back up the winding road to my cabin. I parked it in the driveway and walked out onto my porch. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. The bamboo wind chimes, a quiet monument to the absurdity of it all, stirred in the evening breeze, their tone perfectly compliant with my own personal code of conduct. I looked out at the valley and my eyes settled on the fence. The old cedar rails, weathered and gray, stood strong and true, following the lay of the land. It was more than just a boundary marker. It was a line I had refused to let anyone cross. It was a symbol of principle, of resilience, of the fight to protect not just a piece of land, but a way of life. This cabin was my fortress, built not just of wood and stone, but of love and memory. Sarah would have loved this. She would have been proud. In that moment, sitting on the porch of the home I had almost lost, I felt her presence more strongly than ever. The peace I had fought for halfway around the world, I had been forced to fight for again, right here. And in the quiet hum of the evening, in the safety of these walls, in the hard-won freedom of this small patch of earth, I knew that justice, like a well-built house, was a beautiful thing to behold. It was solid, it was lasting, and it was finally truly mine.